Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. Elias Thorne had driven until the road dissolved into a memory, leaving him with nothing but the crunch of pine needles beneath his old tires and a creeping sense of being watched. He didn't want the world to watch him anymore. That was the whole point. He de-signed the lease for the cabin site unseen, lured by a listing that promised total immersion in the silence of nature. Now, standing at the edge of the whisperwood, silence felt less like an amenity and more like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The cabin itself was a monolith of rough, hewn cedar, squatting low beneath the canopy of ancient, dense firs. It wasn't rustic. It was forgotten. The porch sagged slightly, and the single window facing the clearing was opaque with grime and time. Elias inhaled deeply, smelling only damp earth, mold, and something else. A thin, metallic scent, like old copper. He wrestled his antique typewriter and a heavy duffel bag out of the trunk of his Volvo, the only sounds tearing through the overwhelming quiet. When he tried the key, the lock groaned in protest, a sound less mechanical and more like a human sigh. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick and tasting of dust. The cabin was a single, large room, dominated by a monstrous stone fireplace. A rough wooden table served as the kitchen, flanked by two single beds pushed against the far wall. Light struggled to enter, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift faster than they should. Elias set up his equipment first, the typewriter on the small desk by the window and his satellite phone on the table. He needed two things to survive the next 6 months: caffeine and the occasional ability to prove he was still alive. He flipped the phone open. No signal. Of course. He walked toward the window, holding it up, rotating it slowly. Still nothing. Frustration tightened his chest. The listing had promised minimal but reliable coverage. He tried again by the door, then in the center of the room. Dead. Completely, stubbornly dead. Sighing, Elias reached into his bag for the shortwave radio he brought as a last-minute redundancy. It was a beautiful, heavy piece of equipment, and he found a surprisingly clear frequency, a stream of classical music, heavy on cello and bass, played with a low, mournful cadence. He tuned it to an all-new station, just to hear a human voice. The broadcast was clear for about 5 seconds. Missing for 3 days. Search teams report no sign of the vehicle. Then the audio was violently consumed by static. It wasn't a normal white noise static. It was deep, guttural, and pulsing, like a massive heart struggling to beat. Elias slapped the side of the radio. The pulsing grew louder, and the glass vacuum tubes inside the unit glowed an angry, unsettling orange. He quickly ripped the power cord from the wall. The radio fell instantly silent, but the oppressive pulse seemed to linger, vibrating deep in the cedar floorboards beneath his feet. Elias stood motionless in the gloom, his heart suddenly running a frantic marathon against his ribs. He told himself it was just a geomagnetic anomaly, a busted tube, or a storm moving in. It was logical. It had to be logical. He was a writer, a man of words and reason. Then, from the impenetrable darkness outside the window, a darkness that was settling in far too fast for a late autumn afternoon, he heard it. It was a faint, high-pitched tapping, not rhythmic, not urgent, but a slow, deliberate sound, like a child's fingernail, gently testing the glass. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that the window was sealed shut from the outside. He knew it because he was the one who had nailed it shut for security just 10 minutes ago. Elias did not move. He did not breathe. He just listened to the tap, tap, tap grow marginally closer, and he realized the sound wasn't coming from the glass. It was coming from the wood, the solid, unforgiving cedar of the front door. The sound was not a bang or a scrape. It was worse. It was an inquisitive, delicate tap, tap that seemed to originate not from the surface of the door, but from deep within the cellulose fibers of the cedar itself. Elias stood frozen, the phantom pulse of the static still throbbing in his ears, a counterpoint to the slow, agonizing beat of his own heart. The darkness outside had fully committed, swallowing the faint twilight and leaving the cabin as interior in a suffocating gray gloom. He gripped the cast iron handle of his duffel bag, the only solid familiar thing nearby. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, it was pregnant, loaded with anticipation. He imagined the thing, whatever it was, a branch, an animal, a prank, standing right there, inches away, simply listening to his inability to breathe. Elias finally moved, not to run, but to secure himself. Logic, however frayed, dictated movement. He fumbled for the thick, iron fireplace poker, its weight a comforting anchor. He found the heaviest pieces of kindling and pushed them against the base of the front door, then dragged the rough wooden table until its edge scraped painfully against the door frame, wedging it shut. It was a pathetic defense against anything determined, but it was all he had. He lit the single kerosene lantern he had brought, and the warm golden light did little to dispel the shadows. It merely sharpened their edges, making the room seem more angular and hostile. In the increased visibility, he saw it, near the base of the monstrous stone fireplace, where the hearth met the cedar floorboards, was a fracture. It was not a new crack. The house had settled long ago, but something was in it. Thin, almost invisible filaments, the color of bleached bone and the texture of dried sinew, were pushing out. They looked like aggressive, fast-growing mold, except they moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, extending millimeters at a time, probing the air. Elias knelt, his breath hitching. He ran a finger over the surface of the floor, not touching the filaments, but feeling the wood around. It wasn't the expected chill of an abandoned cabin. The cedar was warm, not heated, but retaining a low, internal warmth, like a body. He grabbed a utility knife and scraped violently at the growth. It resisted, not with the crumble of mold, but with the stubborn resilience of rubber. When he finally sliced through a filament, it didn't snap. It wept a clear, faintly viscous fluid that instantly evaporated, leaving behind a sharp spike in the metallic, copper smell that haunted the cabin. "It's just decay," he whispered aloud, needing the sound of his own voice to anchor him. "It was a fungus. It's mycelium pushing through damp wood." But mycelium didn't move. Not like that. Not with the intention he perceived behind the slow, relentless extension. He spent the next hour meticulously checking every seam and joint. The filaments were everywhere, concentrating around points of ingress. The windowsill he had recently nailed shut, the narrow gap beneath the back wall where the ground level was highest, and particularly around the desk where he had placed his typewriter. They seemed drawn to the desk, climbing the rough, hewn legs like tiny, hungry vines. He pulled his typewriter away from the wall. Behind it, the entire back corner of the cabin was compromised. The cedar logs were darkened and swollen, and from a major vertical split, a cluster of the fibers emerged, thicker here, braided and slightly darker, a sickly, purplish hue. This was more than just mold. This looked like a root system, but inside, where it shouldn't be, he shuddered, feeling like he was staring into the capillary system of a colossal, sleeping thing, driven by a primal need for human contact. Elias tried the satellite phone again. He climbed onto the roof, a risky maneuver in the pitch black, and held the device high above the pitch. Still, nothing. The forest was an electromagnetic dead zone, intentionally or otherwise. As he descended, his foot slipped on the mossy shingles. He braced himself, instinctively grabbing the gutter, but it came away in his hand with a sickening crunch of dry rot. He tumbled the last few feet, landing hard on his shoulder, the breath knocked out of him, lying on the damp ground, staring up at the overwhelming light. Swallowing trees, he heard it again. The pulse, it wasn't teeth static this time. It was the subsonic thrum of the ground itself. He realized the warmth inside the cabin wasn't tea due to residual heat. It was biological, a mild fever. The cabin was breathing. He crawled back inside, bruised and defeated. He kicked the filaments away from the door, the resistance a disturbing indicator of their embedded depth. He needed to rest, to find logic, to write. He looked at the two single beds pushed against the wall. They looked uncomfortable, but harmless. He chose the one closer to the fireplace. As he spread his sleeping bag, he noticed that the pillow on the other bed was slightly depressed, as if someone had just lifted their head from it. Elias knew he hadn't touched that bed. He had arrived alone, carrying only 2 bags. He ran his hand over the depression. It felt cool, but the rest of the bedding felt subtly warm. He stared at the pillow, a knot of cold dread forming in his stomach. The depression wasn't caused by a head. It was too narrow and long. It looked like the impression left by a person lying on their side, their head curled around something small and heavy. He grabbed the poker again, his knuckles white. Whatever this is, he muttered to the pulsing, breathing structure around him, "You are not getting in." He settled onto his own bed, the lantern casting nervous, flickering light on the walls. The metallic smell was now so strong, it tasted like licking a battery. He was tired, exhausted to the bone, yet every nerve ending was screaming alarm. He closed his eyes, determined to sleep, determined to wake up and see only mold, not movement. But the last thought before sleep took him was the fear that the tap, tap, tap wasn't a request to come in, but a confirmation that something was already there, slowly testing the material that was rapidly becoming its skin. The morning didn't break. It merely grudged a little more light into the clearing. Elias woke up with a dry, coppery taste in his mouth, and the vivid imprint of the pillow depression burned behind his eyelids. The first thing he did was confirm the filaments were still there. They were, perhaps a millimeter further extended toward the center of the room, stiff and pale in the weak daylight. He needed to write. Writing was his shield, his sanity anchor. He was here to complete his novel, a sprawling historical fiction about a city architect slowly losing his grip on reality as his perfect concrete structures began to develop organic root, like flaws. The irony was a bitter, cold laugh in the vast silence. He sat at the desk, the heavy black body of his typewriter, a 1930s Royal, a reassuring presence. He opened his manuscript, the spire of ascendancy, and rolled a blank page into the carriage. His fingers hovered over the keys, ready to start typing chapter 14. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, his mind was filled with the metallic scent and the feeling of the wood's internal warmth. He tried to force the plot. Architect Alistair Vane inspected the foundation of the newly poured column. He noticed a hairline crack, a slight imperfection. Elias typed, Architect Alistair Vane inspected the foundation. He didn't he see a crack. He smelled copper. The concrete was warm, almost feverish, and from the earth the cedar spoke, not with words, but with a deep, pulsing static. Alistair felt roots growing in his teeth. He stared at the words, horrified. This wasn't his story. This was an invasive, parasitic thought, using the language of his current situation to overwrite his carefully constructed world. He ripped the page out, his hands trembling. He had to resist this immediate, dangerous absorption. He tried again, focusing on the character, his motivation, his internal monologue. Alistair Vane needed to finish the spire. It was his life. Work, his testament against the decay of the city. He needed to prove he was still sane, still in control. He typed. Alistair Vane needed to surrender to the arbor line. It was older than the city, older than his petty ambition. It wanted his memories, his narrative, to strengthen its structure. The only control left was to give in. The words were alien, yet intensely personal, tapping into a nascent fear he hadn't even fully formed yet. The arbor line. Where had that name come from? It wasn't in his research, not in his notes. It was a name delivered by the wood itself, frustrated and deeply unnerved. Elias pushed the desk away from the infested corner, ignoring the painful scraping sound. As the desk moved, a small, dark object slipped from beneath the bottom drawer and clattered onto the floor. It was a small, pocket-sized book, bound in cracked, dark leather. It was not the kind of journal one keeps for pleasant thoughts. It was stiff, water, damaged, and smelled intensely of that same metallic earth scent. The pages were thin and brittle, covered in tight, desperate handwriting that bled through the paper. He opened it to the first page. The ink was faded, but legible. The writer's name, scrawled shackily, was Silas Vance, the 4th of August, 1968. I've been here for 3 months. I thought the silence would cure me of the noise. It only replaced it with a deeper, more insistent thrum. I hear them now, not with my ears, but in the low vibrations of the floor. The cabin is not built on the earth. It is built into something that is trying to grow through it. Elias skipped forward, his eyes widening as he recognized themes that were chillingly familiar. The 12th of September, 1968. The warmth is increasing. They want me to believe it is protection, but it is absorption. I saw the filaments today, pushing through the seam by the chimney. They are hungry for carbon, for paper, for story. I tried to leave my map of the clearing, but the path rejected me. It wants me to stay and become a node. The 2nd of October, 1968. They gave me a name for their collective consciousness. It is not roots, not a simple colony. It is a network, an ancient, dark intelligence, waiting for the right kind of mind to feed on. They call it the arbor line, and they have promised me that if I write its truth, I can become the cedar's breath. The last entry, dated only 2 days later, was barely readable. The handwriting was no longer ink, but a reddish, brown stain pressed deep into the fibers of the paper. The 4th of October, 1968. The tapping is louder now. Not outside. Inside, they are trying to write through me. My thoughts are no longer mine. The truth of the arbor line is not that it eats flesh, but that it eats self. I must, if he comes, he must read this first. He must know how to fight the static. Asterisk, the final few pages were not handwriting at all, but a tangled, spiraling pattern of small dots and dashes, as if the pen had been used long after the ink ran out, gouging the paper until it tore. Elias dropped the journal as if it were burning. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt monumental, oppressive. Silas Vance had been here. He had seen the filaments, felt the warmth, heard the static, and named the entity. And his last thoughts were not of escape, but of a successor. If he comes, he must read this first. Elias looked at the beds. Had Silas lain on that other bed, writing until the last coherent thought was stolen? Had the arbor line absorbed his consciousness like fertilizer for its roots? The metallic, coppery scent of the cabin suddenly seemed less like old metal and more like dried blood. Elias picked up the journal again, a terrible realization dawning. If the arbor line consumed story and memory, then his own novel, the manuscript he had brought into this place, was not a shield. It was a feast. He had brought the arbor line exactly what it hungered for. After reading Silas Vance's desperate testimony, Elias felt a dizzying pressure behind his eyes, a phantom weight suggesting the transfer of a consciousness too dark and old to contain. He paced the length of the single room, the leather bound journal clutched in his hand. He was no longer battling simple isolation. He was fighting a parasitic narrative. The arbor line wanted his story, his identity, to become another layer of mulch beneath its ancient roots. He needed water desperately. The coppery taste in his mouth was so strong, it felt like his tongue was plated with rust. He found his field canteen in his duffel bag, a small victory of logistics over looming terror. The cabin had a tiny segmented corner near the back designated as the washroom, containing a dented metal sink and a small, poorly framed mirror hanging above it. The glass was old and warped, the reflective silver peeling away at the edges like ancient parchment. Elias turned the cold tap, but only a sluggish, brownish trickle emerged, sputtering with the metallic smell. He waited, letting the tap run, but the smell only intensified, making his stomach clench. He looked up at the mirror. It was completely fogged, not with steam. The room was cold, but with a dense white obscurity, as if the humidity of the whisperwood had decided to claim this one surface as its own. Elias reached out and wiped a clear circle into the vapor with the heel of his hand. In the center of the clean circle, his reflection materialized. He stared at himself, the tired, pale face, the 3-day stubble, a haunted look in his eyes, all perfectly normal. He nodded at himself, relieved. See, rational, nothing here. He wiped a larger area, clearing the entire glass surface. But as the full reflection snapped into focus, Elias recoiled with a sharp, involuntary gasp, stumbling back into the wooden sink frame. It was Elias undeniably, but it was wrong. The face staring back was too long, stretched vertically, the proportions warped, as if reflected in a funhouse mirror designed for cruelty. His eyes were wide, but the pupils were dilated to pinpricks, sunken deep beneath heavy, dark brows that looked less like hair and more like patches of moss. The most sickening detail was his mouth. It was stretched into a grimace that extended too far across his cheekbones, revealing too much. There were too many teeth, tiny needle, sharp teeth that seemed to crowd and overlap, forming a sickening, glistening lattice. Elias stared, his heart hammering against his ribs, refusing the image. He clamped his hands over his mouth, checking his own teeth, running his tongue over the familiar, smooth ridges. They were normal, perfectly normal. He blinked rapidly, fighting the urge to vomit. When he opened his eyes, the reflection had snapped back to normal. Just Elias Thorne, exhausted, paranoid, but intact. He leaned in, examining the glass. The air in the washroom was thin and cold. There was no explanation for the fog. no explanation for the spontaneous, terrifying distortion. He pressed his palms hard against his eye sockets, counting slowly to 10, trying to excise the memory of the two. Many teeth, he tried wiping the mirror again. As his hand moved across the glass, the horrifying image preceded the clear reflection, flashing for a microsecond, the elongated skull, the crowded, predatory smile, before settling back into his normal face. The arbor line wasn't he just stealing his past. It was warping his present, attacking the very basis of his self-perception. It was showing him what he was becoming, or what it wanted him to be. He decided on a strategy of aggressive denial. He had to eliminate the mirror. It was a vector for the entity's influence. He grabbed his hammer from his toolbox and, without a moment of hesitation, swung it against the glass. The mirror didn't shatter into thousands of shards. Instead, it cracked with a thick, muffled sound, like breaking a sheet of frozen mud. 3 large pieces remained, suspended by the brittle frame and the backing board. The sickening part was that each of the 3 pieces now held a separate, complete reflection of his face. All normal, but all staring in slightly different directions, like 3 separate, fractured identities. He grabbed an old, musty towel and violently covered the mirror, tucking the edges tightly around the frame. The moment the mirror was obscured, the pulse returned. It wasn't the sound of the static or the thrumming of the ground. It was an internal beat, a deep, rhythmic pressure that radiated from his own chest, echoing the feverish warmth of the cedar walls. The arbor line had shifted its tactics. It no longer needed his eyes to deliver the horror. It was now trying to colonize his inner monologue. Elias walked back to the center of the cabin, the fireplace poker dragging lightly behind him. He needed to write, to find a logical explanation in the midst of this waking nightmare. But every time he thought of a word, he felt a silent root, like tendril wrapping around it, pulling it down into the dark earth. He was losing his language, his sight, and his sanity, piece by terrifying piece. The sight of the journal on the table suddenly felt like an imperative. Silas Vance had given him the playbook, a warning written in blood and fear. Elias knew he had to understand the arbor line's methods, its hunger for memory and story, before his own words became the fertilizer for the next writer. Demise. The cabin had successfully stripped Elias of his self-image. Now, it focused on his senses. The scent of copper, sharp, and mineral had become the primary atmosphere, coating the air, the furniture, and the very back of Elias' throat. He felt nauseous, not just from fear, but from the constant, low-grade chemical assault. He spent the next day engaged in a frantic, desperate act of cleaning, a delusion of control in a space where control was an illusion. He scrubbed the floorboards, wiped down the dusty shelves, and reorganized his meager supplies. He was looking for the source of the smell, or perhaps, subconsciously, the source of the infection. The scent was strongest near the 2 single beds against the far wall. The unsettling impression of Silas Vance's head still lingered on the second pillow, a hollow left by a man consumed. Elias decided to dismantle the sleeping arrangement, needing to see the floor beneath the heavy antique frames. He heaved the beds away from the wall, the effort momentarily distracting him from the low, internal warmth of the cedar. As the second bed frame scraped across the floor, he saw it beneath the area where Silas' pillow would have rested. A patch of floorboards roughly 3 feet by 2 feet was profoundly, irreversibly stained. It wasn't simple water damage or mold. The wood fibers were saturated with a substance that had long since dried, leaving a deep, reddish, brown patina. It looked like ancient, dried blood, yet it emitted the overwhelming, metallic copper scent. The stain was deep, resisting all his efforts to scrub it. He knelt, running his hand over the area. The wood here was subtly different, softer, almost spongy, giving slightly under pressure. This spot was the epicenter of the infection. It lay directly above the point where he had seen the thick, purplish root cluster emerging from the foundation crack in Chapter 2. This wasn't where Silas slept. It was where Silas had been absorbed. Elias grabbed a bottle of potent disinfectant and poured it liberally over the stain. Instead of bubbling or lifting, the liquid was instantly consumed, vanishing into the wood fibers as if into dry blotting paper. A small cloud of grayish vapor rose momentarily, carrying the copper scent to a searing intensity. Before the wood inhaled it completely, the stain remained, dark and unforgiving. As he worked, scrubbing uselessly at the arbor line, mark, his eyes were drawn to the perimeter of the stain. In the grain of the wood, he thought he could make out a pattern within the reddish hue. Not random splashes, but faint, spiraling lines, converging upon a central point beneath the floor. They looked like a petrified circulatory system. Exhaustion finally claimed him. The scrubbing had drained his physical reserves, and the constant sensory input, the smell, the low thrumming pulse, had destroyed his nerves. He collapsed onto his own, clean bed, pulling the sleeping bag over his head in a futile attempt to shut out the world. Sleep, however, offered no refuge. It delivered him directly into the arbor line, waiting consciousness. He was no longer Elias Thorne. He was heavy, immobile, compressed. He was trapped deep underground, the sensation of gravity inverted, pressing him down instead of holding him up. He tried to scream, but the earth filled his mouth, silty and metallic. He couldn't move his limbs. They were rigid, bound, and numb. But he was aware, terribly, sickeningly aware. He could feel the cold, moist pressure of the soil against every inch of his skin. Then the pressure began to change. He felt a slow, icy sensation that was earth or mud, but organic matter. It was the arbor line. He felt a dense, living coil, thick as a man's arm, pressing down on his chest, constricting his breathing. Smaller filaments, like the ones he saw in the cabin walls, began to probe his skin, seeking points of entry, nostrils, tear ducts, the corners of his eyes. The entity communicated not through words, but through sensation, a feeling of vast, ancient hunger and cold, triumphant patience. You are home now. You are perfect food. You have the stories. Elias tried to fight, but the arbor line countered, not with strength, but with memory. It flooded his mind with images that weren't his. A man writing frantically in a small book. His name was Silas. Silas standing exactly where Elias stood, smelling the same copper scent. Silas falling to the ground, his eyes wide in terror as the darkness consumed him. Then, a terrible, dizzying flash of memory from hundreds of years ago. A different man, a trapper, also yielding his identity to the deep wood. The arbor line was a library of absorbed consciousness, and Elias was about to become the newest addition. He woke up with a gasping, silent scream, thrashing violently against the sleeping bag. He was back in the cabin, the lantern long extinguished. The room was black, utterly silent, and suffocatingly warm. He sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat. The metallic scent was overwhelming, tasting like the very blood pumping through his veins. He looked down at his own bed, then toward the wall where the arbor line had its epicenter. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he saw it, a pale, bone, white filament, thicker than the others, had crept out from the stained floor patch and was gently, silently touching the wooden corner post of his bed frame. It was waiting, patient, ready to climb. The arbor line had brought the darkness into his sleep, and now it was actively reaching for his body. Elias did not get out of bed. He catapulted out. His feet hit the cold, rough floorboards, and he scrambled backward until his spine hit the solid cedar wall near the fireplace. The lingering warmth of the wood was now repulsive. The soft tissue of a predator he had slept beside. He stared across the room. The pale, bone, white filament that had been touching his bed frame had retracted. The floor patch was still dark, still pulsing with that silent subsonic thrum. But the immediate threat had pulled back, perhaps satisfied with the terror it had harvested from his sleeping mind. The dream, however, was violently intact. He still tasted the metallic earth, still felt the icy pressure of the massive root coil on his chest. He was not just trapped in a cabin, he was trapped within a living network that consumed consciousness. His only chance of survival was immediate, physical escape. He abandoned all pretense of writing or understanding. Logic was a luxury he could no longer afford. He threw his meager supplies into the duffel bag. A few bottles of stale water, some energy bars, Silas, journal. He could. Leave it. It was a weapon now. And the useless satellite phone. He left the heavy typewriter on the desk, a defiant, analog relic he hoped the arbor line could digest. The metallic smell was an unbearable stench now, a thick copper fog that seemed to thicken the air with every labored breath. It was the smell of ancient, concentrated life, and it was driving him mad. He slung the bag over his shoulder, grabbed the iron poker, and approached the front door. He kicked the wooden table away from the frame, ignoring the dull, protesting thud that echoed too loudly in the small room. He wrenched the door open. The daylight was weak and hostile, filtering through a sky choked with heavy, low, hanging clouds. The clearing looked exactly as it had when he arrived. A small, ragged circle of damp earth, surrounded by the implacable, overwhelming density of the whisperwood. Elias ran. He ran not toward the invisible main road, but simply away from the cabin. He plunged into the trees, pushing through low, hanging cedar branches that scratched his face and clothes. He kept his eyes fixed forward, trying to maintain a straight line through the seemingly random distribution of trees. The forest immediately began its work. The silence here was different from the cabin. Oppressive quiet. This was a dead silence. There was no wind in the canopy, no birdsong, no rustle of small animals. Every sound Elias made, his ragged breathing, the squelch of his boots in the damp earth, the rapid beating of his heart, was magnified, yet simultaneously muffled, as if filtered through miles of thick, absorbing moss. He walked fast, adrenaline replacing exhaustion. He estimated he had been walking for 45 minutes, keeping the weak sunlight directly over his left shoulder to maintain a rough eastern trajectory. The terrain was challenging, marked by deep drifts of pine needles and treacherous moss-covered rocks. He paused, leaning against the damp, cold bark of a massive fir, wiping sweat and pine resin from his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath, intending to listen for any traffic noise, a horn, an engine, anything, to guide him toward the road. He heard nothing but his own pulse, thudding painfully in his ears. As he turned to continue, he froze. Directly ahead of him, half, hidden by a thick screen of hanging moss, was a tree he knew. It was a massive, ancient cedar. Its trunk split into 3 distinct, upward, spiraling columns, giving it the appearance of a monstrous wooden candelabra. Elias remembered passing it on his way into the forest. He remembered thinking how distinctive it was, a landmark he couldn't miss, but he was supposed to be miles from the cabin now. The triple, trunked cedar was meant to be closer to the clearing. A cold, sickening certainty gripped him. He hadn't walked in a straight line. He had walked in a wide, careful circle. The arbor line was gently guiding him, using the familiar landmarks of the wood to reel him back in. The forest floor was not letting him go. Panic flared, hot and sharp. He dropped his duffel bag, pulling out the utility knife. He cut a thick strip from the bottom of his cotton undershirt and tied it conspicuously around the trunk of the candelabra. Cedar, this was his starting point. This time he would not fail. He chose a completely new direction, aiming for what looked like a dip in the terrain, suggesting a stream or a drainage path that might lead to a larger track. He started walking again, counting his steps, forcing a methodical rhythm. Despite the screaming alarm in his head, the next 2 hours were a blur of intense physical effort and profound sensory denial. Time seemed to stretch and compress at random intervals. He would walk for what felt like 10 minutes, and yet his body would feel the aching fatigue of a full afternoon. His height, he would walk for what felt like an eternity, only to look down and see the same familiar pattern of moss and exposed root tendrils beneath his feet. The metallic, coppery smell of the cabin, which should have dissipated in the open air, was instead following him, clinging to him, mixing with the damp scent of the forest like a poisonous fog. He noticed the trees around him were subtly changing. They were not growing naturally. The branches seemed to twist inward, forming a dense interlocking lattice overhead that blocked out the light, creating a perpetual claustrophobic dusk. The growth was too perfect, too deliberate. Steering his movement, he fought through a final, dense thicket of spruce, his lungs burning, his mind exhausted by the struggle against the disorientation. He pushed aside one last heavy branch, stepping out into an open, light-filled space. He stood perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. He was back. He was standing exactly where he had started, at the perimeter of the clearing. The dark cedar cabin, squat and silent, stood maybe 70 feet away. It was a sight of utter, horrifying defeat. The arbor line hadn't physically stopped him. It had simply used its deep topographical influence to turn the forest into a perfectly calibrated, inescapable labyrinth. He felt the heavy, quiet thrum beneath his feet now, stronger than it had been in the cabin. The earth itself was mocking him. Elias walked slowly toward the center of the clearing, dropping his bag. He turned back toward the tree line where he had just emerged, checking to see the shirt marker he had tied to the triple. Trunked cedar. It was gone. The cedar itself was gone. The arbor line didn't just turn him around. It erased the memory of his attempts. As he moved closer to the edge of the clearing, near where the ground gave way to the dense forest floor, he saw something new. It wasn't organic growth, but a deliberate construction. Nestled between two large moss-covered roots that seemed to pulse faintly with the cabin. Its feverish warmth was a cairn. It was a small, disturbingly neat stack of stones. They weren't natural field stones. They were smooth, gray river stones, meticulously cleaned and stacked in an ascending pyramid. They were interleaved with perfectly snapped, equal length pieces of cedar branches. The entire structure was roughly knee-high and stood with a silent, menacing authority, a sentinel marking a boundary. Elias walked toward it, his boots crunching loudly on the dead leaves. He knelt, staring at the cairn. It was recent. The cedar pieces were too cleanly broken, the stones too deliberately placed, and no creature of the forest built monuments. Then he saw the pattern. The stones weren't T stacked straight up. The entire pile twisted slightly to the left, and the cedar branches were woven through the gaps in a way that mimicked the spiraling, consuming lines he had seen embedded in the bloody stain on the floorboards back in Chapter 5. It was the mark of the arbor line. This cairn was not just a landmark, it was an active marker constructed not by a person, but by the arbor line itself, using its tools, the forest, the previous occupant, as labor, or perhaps just its own root strength, to announce the boundary of his new cage. This is the edge of your world, Elias Thorne, he realized with a profound, bone-deep terror that the cairn was a gift, a sign of its cruel patience. The arbor line didn't want him to simply die. It wanted him to know he was trapped. It wanted him to surrender his self before it began the final, inevitable process of absorption. The defeat of the clearing was absolute. Elias did not just walk back to the cabin. He felt as though he was being gently, inexorably extruded by the forest, pushed from its suffocating green flesh, and deposited back on the doorstep of his cage. The sight of the cairn, the arbor line, monument to his failure, was the final psychological blow. It was an insult built from the earth he had tried to escape. He slammed the door shut, wedging the wooden table back into place, with a violence born of terror. The cabin, with its low fever and its coppery stench, no longer felt like shelter, but like a monstrous stomach. Elias slumped against the door, the taste of metallic dirt still sharp in his mouth from the nightmare of being buried. The arbor line had conquered his sight, the mirror, his mobility, the labyrinthine forest, and his very sense of self, the memory wrought on the typewriter. He needed one last objective tether to reality. He needed proof that what was happening was real, external, and recordable. He remembered an old, high-quality audio recorder he had brought for capturing environmental sounds. Birdsong, wind, subtle atmosphere. For his writing, a purely analog device, heavy and clunky, running on batteries and cassette tape. Perhaps its outdated, non-digital nature would shield it from the arbor line, specific brand of electromagnetic static and corruption. He rummaged through the duffel bag, pulling out the Sony TCM-5000 EV, a sturdy machine that looked capable of surviving an earthquake. He loaded a fresh cassette and stared at the red record button. If this worked, he could document his sanity and the external threat in his own voice. He placed the recorder on the desk, pointed toward the center of the room, and pressed record. The tiny red light glowed, a comforting, mundane indication of verifiable activity. "This is Elias Thorne," he began, his voice hoarse and thin, struggling against the suffocating silence of the cabin. I believe it is day 5. I can be sure. I am recording this to document the events and confirm my psychological stability against a perceived external threat. He spoke for the next hour, detailing everything: the immediate failure of the satellite phone, the fibrous, pale filaments pushing through the wood, the discovery of Silas Vance's journal, and the terrifying mention of the arbor line. He meticulously described the horrifying distortion in the mirror, the bloody copper stain on the floor, the suffocating burial dream, and finally, his failed attempt to escape and the appearance of the new ritualistic cairn at the clearing's edge. As he spoke, he walked, occasionally touching the wooden walls. The structure itself, he narrated, tapping the back wall near the infested corner, is emitting a palpable warmth, a fever. The air is saturated with a copper, mineral scent. I believe this is the scent of the arborline, as metabolic process. It's feeding, it feels alive, and it listens. He paused, looking directly at the recorder. I have not slept well. I have been given images of the previous occupant, Silas Vance, being absorbed, becoming part of the root system. It seems the arbor line consumes the human story, the memories, the self, as fuel. Elias finished the recording, pressing stop. He ejected the cassette, staring at the brown magnetic tape. Physical, tangible proof of his words. This was real. He hadn't imagined the sound. The machine had captured it. Now came the true test. He rewound the tape and pressed play. His voice filled the small cabin, sounding remarkably small and pathetic against the silence. This is Elias Thorne. It is. I believe it is day 5. I can be sure. Hearing his own words, organized and rationalized, was an immense relief. The threat felt contained, reduced to an anecdote. He listened patiently through the long monologue. Everything was crisp and clear, until he reached the section where he had described the cabin, warmth, and the metallic scent. As his recorded voice said, the air is saturated with a copper mineral scent. I believe this is the scent of the arbor line, as metabolic process. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the audio frequency. A low, vibrating hum entered the recording, a sound that seemed to originate from beneath the cabin. A sound Elias had not consciously heard while speaking, but now recognized as the background thrum of the arbor line. It was the same subsonic pulse he had felt in the floor. Then, faint at first, barely audible above the hum, came the whispers. They weren't tea language. They were a metallic, sibilant friction, like dry leaves being dragged across copper sheeting. They overlaid his voice, wrapping around his carefully chosen words, like parasitic vines. He turned the volume up, his hands shaking. He knelt close to the speaker, trying to isolate the sound. The hum intensified, and the metallic whispering grew bolder. It was no longer just friction, it was breath, a long, drawn out exhalation that seemed impossibly deep. Elias pressed pause, his chest tight. He swallowed the nausea brought on by the sudden, concentrated smell of copper now radiating from the recorder. He took a deep breath and pressed play again, focusing entirely on the whispers. The hum returned, and the sibilance began to coalesce. It was structuring itself, shaping into rudimentary sounds. It sounded like someone gargling with sand, attempting to force air through a throat clogged with fiber. Then, a moment of profound, cold clarity. As his recorded voice stated, it seems the arbor line consumes the human story, the memories, the self, as fuel. The whispering cut through sharply, momentarily overriding his own voice. It was a word. It was the word, yes. But it was not his voice. It was a raspy, parched voice, brittle and infinitely sad, laced with the metallic tang of dried blood. It was a human voice, but one that had been stretched, degraded, and absorbed by something ancient and patient. Elias knew it instantly. Silas Vance. Silas, S. corrupted echo was speaking directly to Elias through the mechanical medium. The arbor line hadn't destroyed the technology. It had hijacked it, using the tape recorder as a temporary vocal cord for the man it had consumed 60 years ago. The voice continued, quieter now, a desperate, fading plea layered beneath the sound of tearing fiber. It is better to let it take the story, Elias. Dawn to write, the guardian is coming. Dawn to write the story. The message faded back into the metallic hum and the sibilant friction, which sounded like thousands of tiny roots scraping against each other in dark delight. Elias shut the machine off with a trembling hand, the sudden silence deafening. He stared at the tape recorder, then at the spot on the floor where Silas had been absorbed, and finally at the small leather-bound journal. The arbor line had just given him a direct confirmation of its intent, a clear warning from its last victim, and a horrifying piece of information. The guardian, something worse than the arbor line itself, was arriving, and Silas Vance, despite being consumed, was trying to save him, or perhaps simply trying to warn the next victim away from the fate he had sealed with his own writings. Elias had failed to capture a rational recording, but he had captured a message. The tape was now a living, malevolent artifact. He had to understand what Silas meant. What story was so dangerous that it would summon this guardian? He picked up Silas, his journal determined to find the next clue before the arbor line finished recording its own final, triumphant chapter over Elias Thorne. The cassette recorder sat on the desk, silent and inert, a mere shell now that the echo of Silas Vance had faded. Elias stared at the machine, then at the wooden walls, no longer seeing lumber but an endless fibrous ear. The arbor line was not a distant entity. It was the house, the floor, the air, and it had an advocate, Silas, warning him, "Don't write the story." The message was clear, yet maddeningly opaque. The arbor line consumed the human story, the memories, the self, as fuel. But why was writing the act that summoned the guardian? Was the story itself a trigger, or was it the act of defining the trauma that gave it form? Elias picked up the journal. He had to stay awake. Sleep was no longer a rest. It was a scheduled appointment with the arbor line, its digestive process. He would drink the metallic, tasting water. His body craved its copper-laced contamination now, and he would read. He needed to find what Silas had written right before he was consumed. He sat by the desk, the kerosene lantern casting long, unstable shadows that danced with the low, internal light emanating from the cedar grain. He ignored the incessant, low hum beneath the floor, ignoring the sickly, sweet copper smell that felt like liquid metal pooling in his throat. He opened Silas' journal to the final, frantic pages. Silas's handwriting had degraded violently. The neat, academic script of the early entries had devolved into scrawled, pressurized glyphs. Day 48. I think time is soup. I can only feel the pulse now, not hear it. It wants my plot points. It asks for the structure of my grief. I told it about the divorce, about the failure of my book, about the time I watched the deer die by the creek. It takes the pain, wraps it up, and feeds the cold earth. Elias read on, his eyes burning, his exhaustion a physical weight pinning his eyelids down. Silas' descent mirrored his own, but faster, more complete. The arbor line is a root system with a collective memory, but there is a part it fears. The part that is not memory, but pure potential, the unwritten. I wrote about the guardian in chapter 7. I wrote it as a fictional protector, a construct of my own sanity, a warrior to fight the woods. I gave it teeth, I gave it purpose. And when I wrote the description, the hum changed. The cabin grew cold. It demanded I stop. The guardian is summoned by the intention of resistance, the creative act of carving out a defense in the face of absolute consumption. Elias felt a chill far colder than the mountain air. Silas hadn't. He accidentally summoned a monster. He had attempted to create a counter, force within his own narrative, and the arbor line registered the fictional defense as a genuine threat. It was the authorial intent, the defining word. That was the danger. I am going to burn the final pages. I will retract the Guardian. I must unwrite the story, but I don't to know if I have time. I feel the roots. They are waiting for me to sleep. They want the final, crucial scene of my life story, the surrender. The plot hole they need to fill is my consciousness. The final entry was just a smear of ink, followed by two words, scrawled so deeply they tore the paper. It knows. Elias looked at his typewriter, then at the journal, understanding the horror. His presence here, a writer, an architect of narrative, was not random. It was bait. He had been lured here to provide the one thing the arbor line craved, a complete, coherent final story of absorption. He slammed the journal shut. He could risk sleeping. He stood up, intending to pace, to force his muscles into wakefulness. But the metallic smell intensified, releasing a strangely soporific effect. The hum from the floorboards rose from subsonic to audible, a deep, pervasive lullaby. Elias stumbled, fighting the crushing weight of sleep like a physical assailant. He tried to scream, but his voice was a weak croak. He realized the arbor line had been subtly weakening him for days. The tainted water, the constant metallic smell, the sensory overload. It had prepared his body for this moment. He fell onto the floor, the coarse wood rasping against his cheek, but he was already losing the fight. His last coherent thought was a frantic warning to himself. Dawn T dream. Dawn T let it in. Then, the darkness. He was back in the earth. The dream was no longer a suggestion. It was a surgical immersion. He felt the cold, crushing weight of the soil, wet, clay-like, and profoundly cold. The pressure was intense, squeezing the air from his lungs. He was vertical, standing, yet unable to move his feet. He realized his lower half was encased in compressed earth, rigid and numb. He tried to move his arms, but they were trapped, pinned to his sides. He could only turn his head slowly, painfully. Above him, he saw not the ground he had been buried under, but the inverted underside of the cabin floorboards, stretching away into the gloom, a massive, flat ceiling of ancient cedar. This was the perspective of Silas Vance. Then came the new sensation. The arbor line was using its network to communicate a collective, echoing awareness. Elias could feel the consciousness of every dead thing consumed by the woods. Insects, deer, mice, and other human beings, all suspended within the damp, freezing earth. He felt a sudden, sharp, piercing sensation in his right hand. He couldn't scream. The dirt pressed too hard on his chest. It felt like something was slowly, deliberately drilling beneath his fingernail, scraping bone. Then, the pulse. It was no longer the deep, distant thrum of Chapter 7. It was rhythmic, immediate, and utterly cold. Thump, thump, thump. It was the pulse of the arbor line, his heart, and he was pressed against its main artery. With every beat, the dirt surrounding his trapped body compressed, forcing his consciousness deeper into the icy ground. He saw the root tendrils in the dream, thick as pythons, weaving together, forming a tight, muscular coil around his chest. The very sensation he felt in the previous nightmare. But this time they did. T just constrict. They began to pull, to draw the light from him. He was losing his memories, not flashes of Silas, but his own. His mother's face, hazy, the details of his first book contract, just a blur of paper, the color of his first car, gray, then blue, Then nothing. The arbor line was actively extracting the structure of Elias Thorne. He fought, wrenching his right arm against the invisible bonds of the dream. Earth. He managed a tiny movement, a pathetic millimeter. Long twitch of his fingers. The arbor line resisted, its cold pulse screaming a silent, ancient protest. The piercing sensation in his hand became unbearable, a burning, grinding agony. He was losing. He felt the cold earth claiming his mind, the arbor line, as narrative, erasing his own. Elias woke up in a violent fit of shaking, gasping for air that tasted clean for a blessed second before the copper stench flooded back in. He was lying on the floor where he had fallen, curled into a defensive fetal position beside the desk. He sat up, his body drenched in cold sweat, his joints screaming in protest. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, dark, silent, save for the hum and reeking of mineral decay. He was alive. He had survived the arbor line. As scheduled feeding, he looked down at his hands, expecting to find them normal, perhaps bruised from the fall. They weren't. Both hands were completely coated in dark, black, silty soil. It was not dust or the gray remnants of the fireplace. This was rich, cold earth. It was packed so tightly beneath his fingernails that the nail beds were split and bleeding, leaving crescent-shaped marks of deep red blood and black dirt against the pale skin of his palms. He stared, unable to rationalize the horror. He hadn't left the cabin. He hadn't touched the ground outside. He was fully inside a raised wooden structure, yet he had woken up with soil embedded in his body. The arbor line hadn't just reached into his mind. It had reached through the floor, pulled him down, and physically attacked him while he slept. He crawled to the desk, using the dull blade of his utility knife to frantically scrape the dirt out from under his nails. It smelled intensely metallic, the source of the overwhelming copper scent, now clearly identified as the earth itself. As he was scraping, his gaze fell upon the floor directly beneath the desk. The area was dense with shadows, but the lantern provided just enough light to illuminate the central floorboard. There, precisely positioned between the knot holes, was a small, perfectly round, freshly opened hole. It was maybe the size of a dime, impossible to see unless you were right on top of it. The edges were clean and dark, and a faint stream of black, pulverized soil, the very same soil coating his hands, had been deposited beside it like a miniature, malevolent ant. Hill. The hole had not been there the night before. The arbor line had physically burrowed a thin, temporary entry point through the cedar planking, and during his terrifying nightmare, a root, tendril, or perhaps several, had risen through the floor to assault his hands and plant the dream, dirt, onto his person. It had marked him. Elias realized that his hands, the instruments of his writing, the tools of his story, had been the primary target of the attack. The arbor line didn't just want his memories. It wanted to disable his ability to counter its narrative. He looked at the small pile of dirt, then at his own bloodied, scraped hands. The nightmare had stopped precisely when he forced that tiny millimeter, long movement in the dream. His physical resistance, however small, had somehow broken the parasitic connection. He had literally pulled his body out of the dirt. The Guardian was coming, and Elias Thorne's story was being weaponized against him. The only choice left was to fight the arbor line using the very thing it feared most, a creative act of defiance. He had to write, but he had to do it while wide awake, knowing that every word might hasten the arrival of his doom. The physical manifestation of the dream, provides a terrifying escalation. Elias now knows the arbor line can cross the boundary between sleep and wakefulness, and that his writing is the core source of the threat. The scraping stopped. Elias had managed to extract the last sliver of black metallic earth from beneath his torn fingernails. His hands were raw, stinging from the disinfectant he had splashed on them, a useless ritual against something that burrowed through wood and consciousness. He packaged the small pile of dirt he scraped off into a piece of paper, sealing it with duct tape. A physical sample, proof. He didn't dare look at the floor. He knew the small, dime-sized hole was still there, a tiny dark orifice staring up from the cedar planking, a clear invitation for the next trespass. He moved his desk away from the spot, shoving it against the wall, but he knew the movement was futile. The arbor line didn't need that hole. It simply made it to prove a point. I can touch you. The immediate adrenaline rush of the night attack was receding, leaving a vast oceanic emptiness in its wake. This emptiness wasn't just fear. It was a profound, disorienting exhaustion. He felt as though he had run a marathon, and every bone, every joint, was protesting the trauma of being held captive in a dream. State, he needed to establish the time. It was the only way to measure his remaining sanity and supplies. His wristwatch had stopped days ago, the digital display blank, corrupted by the same invisible static that plagued the satellite phone. He picked up the phone. It was stone cold. He pressed the power button, and the screen flashed, briefly displaying 12 am, the 1st of January, 1970. Then, the screen dissolved into shimmering, gray noise. The arbor line, S signature static, white noise given a coppery, mineral, rich texture. The entity had completely wiped the device, S internal clock, reverting it to a foundational moment of digital time, a blank slate of non-existence. No, Elias whispered, his voice catching. You don't get to take that. He threw open the front door. The latch protested, but Elias ignored it. The light outside was weak, a milky, diffused gloom typical of an overcast day. But how long had this specific light persisted? An hour, a day? He looked toward the horizon, trying to find the position of the sun. It was high, almost directly overhead, but muted, like a sickly yellow eye half closed in the fog. He stared, counting seconds. He waited for 10 full minutes, leaning against the doorframe, focusing solely on the sun. Slow arc after 10 minutes, it hadn't moved. Not a visible millimeter. It hung there, fixed, denying the fundamental laws of celestial mechanics. It was as if the sun itself was stalled in the clearing, held motionless by the arbor line. Will. Elias backed into the cabin, pulling the door shut slowly, quietly, as if afraid the movement would draw the entity's attention to his discovery. The arbor line wasn't just confusing him. It was deliberately warping his perception of temporal reality, creating a psychological stasis field. If he couldn't measure time, he couldn't measure his decay, his progress, or the moment of the Guardian's arrival. This realization brought an immediate sickening panic that manifested physically. He was starving. Before the temporal disorientation, Elias had been keeping a rough mental tally. He had arrived with enough supplies for about 7 days of moderate consumption. He believed he was on day 5 when he made the audio recording in Chapter 7. But if time had been warped, if he had fallen asleep for 24 hours instead of 3, his physical reserves would be dangerously low. He dropped his bag and frantically rummaged through the sparse remaining food. 2 water bottles, half full, smelling strongly of copper and sap. He didn't care. He needed the moisture. He took a long, desperate drink, His food supply consisted of 3 foil, wrapped energy bars and a handful of dried nuts. This, he realized, was not 5 days' worth of consumption. This was barely 2 days' worth of supplies. Elias looked at his skeletal reflection in the dark glass window pane. The one that never fogged. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, framed by dark bruises of chronic sleeplessness. He looked like a man who had been starving for a week, maybe more. He gripped the energy bars, their foil cool and clinical against his burning skin. He tried to remember when he had last eaten a full meal. Was it the canned soup on the night he arrived? Had he eaten yesterday? Or was the last memory of consumption 5 days old? He couldn't tell. His memories of eating were as hazy and fragmented as his memory of the plot structure for his book. The arbor line hadn't just stolen his past story. It had stolen the chronological plot of his present life. He pulled back the foil on one energy bar. It was a dense mixture of grains, nuts, and chocolate. A standard hiker's ration. But as he lifted it to his mouth, the intense, cloying smell of copper invaded the chocolate scent. The hum from the floorboards rose slightly, accompanied by a low, insidious hiss. Elias stared at the bar. Had the arbor line contaminated the food as well? Was this another attempt to absorb him, to taint his sustenance, and convert him into its metabolic tool? He was faced with a horrifying dilemma: eat and risk consuming the arbor line's influence, or starve and risk collapsing into the next dream. State where the entity could finish the job unimpeded. He needed energy to write the counter narrative. Without it, his mind would dissolve into the memory rot. Starvation is surrender, he thought bitterly. He took a small, hesitant bite. The taste was overwhelmingly sweet at first, a burst of sugary energy. But then, an immediate, profound change. The bar seemed to disintegrate on his tongue, losing its density and texture. It became chalky, dusty, and then, distinctly, it tasted like rotting wood and iron filings. He spat the mouthful onto the floorboards. Disgusted, the small gob of food hit the wood, and where it landed, the cedar grain seemed to darken instantaneously, absorbing the material with the same rapidity that the wall filaments had absorbed the ink from his notes. The hum underneath rose again, a sound of quiet, pleased ingestion. He had tried to eat the food, but the arbor line was eating the food through him. It was using his ingestion as a vector for its own feeding process. He tossed the remaining bars back into his bag, sealing it tightly. He was isolated not just from the world, but from the most basic, life-sustaining functions. He could trust the water, the air, the ground, or now, the food. He slumped back into the chair, gripping the arms. He was alone, starving, and unable to tell if it was Monday or Saturday. The loss of time was the most terrifying horror yet, because it meant the arbor line could stretch his isolation indefinitely, wearing him down until he was nothing but a story waiting to be typed. Suddenly, a realization struck him, driven by pure hunger and panic. If the arbor line could manipulate time around the cabin, what if it was rushing the time toward the Guardian's arrival? Every moment of confused stasis for Elias could be a week of preparation for the entity. He had no time left. He was out of fuel, out of markers, and running on borrowed time that was actively trying to consume him. He needed an immediate, drastic action. He looked at the typewriter, the only analog machine that still felt neutral, the only weapon Silas had warned him not to use. The counter. Narrative was the only thing that could fight the arbor line's story of consumption. Elias stood up, his legs shaking from weakness. He walked to the window, peering out into the perpetual, milky twilight. The cairn was still visible, sharp and defiant at the edge of the clearing. He pulled the typewriter over to the center of the desk, positioning it under the weak light of the lantern. His hands, still raw from scraping dirt, hovered over the keys. He wouldn't just write his story. He would write a story designed to kill the arbor line. He would write the Guardian into existence, no matter the cost. The Whisperwood Cabin, Chapter 10. The first gift, the typewriter, a black, cast iron Olympia, sat in the weak, perpetual milky daylight of the cabin, the only object that did not feel corrupted. It was solid, mechanical, and fundamentally indifferent to the arbor line, as attempts at subtle psychic domination. It was a tool of structure and plot, which was exactly what the entity feared. Elias had pulled it to the center of the desk, positioning it beneath the kerosene lamp as a sanctuary of light against the encroaching gloom. He sat down, his raw dirt, scraped hands hovering over the cool, round keys. His exhaustion was so extreme it manifested as physical pain. Every movement felt heavy, slow, and cinematic, a silent protest from a body running on nothing but tainted water and sheer terror. He had decided. Silas Vance's warning, "Don't write the story," was less a piece of advice and more an articulation of the entity's core fear. The arbor line wanted surrender, absorption, and silence. To write was to define, to resist, and to give form to the unknown quantity of the Guardian. If the Guardian was merely a construct of Silas's imagination that the arbor line now perceived as a threat, Elias would make that threat real. He would write the arbor line's doom. He carefully fed a fresh, pristine sheet of heavy bond paper into the carriage, aligning the margin stops. The soft thwip of the paper hitting the rubber roller was the loudest sound he had heard all day, an act of defiance in the stasis field of the woods. As the paper settled, the low, ever-present hum beneath the floorboards intensified. It didn't spike or scream. It simply deepened, becoming a rich, pervasive bass note. It felt less like a sound and more like the cabin itself, holding its breath. The sickly, sweet, metallic, copper scent that permeated the air also spiked, tasting like ozone mixed with sap, a sign of psychic energy focusing. Elias closed his eyes and tried to form the first sentence. He wasn't writing a novel. He was writing a magical incantation, a weapon of logic. He needed to establish the Guardian's nature, its purpose, and its weakness. But the moment he tried to conceptualize the words, his mind recoiled. The memory rot, the arbor line's primary defense, was immediate and brutal. He remembered a plot point for his own abandoned novel, a detective, a rainy night, a femme fatale. The memory was sharp, intrusive, and totally irrelevant. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of pure data, the mathematical structure of the Fibonacci sequence, followed by the chilling realization that the sequence could be mapped onto the growth patterns of root systems. The arbor line was fighting his creativity with data, flooding his mind with noise and hijacked, useless knowledge. He gritted his teeth, forcing the distractions out. He opened his eyes, staring at the blank page. He had to externalize the fight, stop battling it internally. Tap. He struck the first key. T-tap, H, tap, E. He typed slowly, deliberately, forcing the metal slug against the ribbon and onto the page. The clatter of the keys was sharp and definitive, like hammer blows against the silence. The Guardian was not born of wood, but of forgotten light. The moment the sentence was complete, the humming stopped. Not faded, not diminished, it simply ceased. The silence that followed was total, dense, and terrifying. It was not the natural silence of the woods, but a vacuum, a sonic hole that swallowed all ambient noise, including the blood rushing in Elias's ears. It was the sound of a vast, ancient consciousness shifting its entire focus onto the single, defiant sentence now imprinted on the paper. Elias felt a profound chill travel from the base of his spine to the crown of his head. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, making his lungs feel too large for his chest. He had done it. He had achieved the desired effect. The arbor line had recognized the severity of the threat. It knew the game had changed from passive digestion to active war. Elias needed a moment to breathe, to savor the tiny victory before plunging back into the breach. He pushed his chair back and stood up, shaky and lightheaded from hunger and the sudden sensory void. He needed the last remaining bottle of metallic, sweet water. He took 3 steps away from the desk, turning his back on the typewriter to retrieve the bottle from his discarded duffel bag near the door. The bag was a shambles, its contents scattered. As he knelt, his eyes wide and unfocused, scanning for the bottle, he heard it. A soundless, perfect placement. It was a soft thud, not the sound of something dropping from above, but of something appearing on the wooden surface of the desk, perfectly deposited there, a physical impossibility, considering the window was bolted shut and the door was behind him. Elias froze, breath held. The profound silence made the smallest sound feel like an explosion. Slowly, carefully, he rose and turned back toward the desk. His eyes immediately fixed on the white page loaded in the typewriter and resting precisely atop his newly typed sentence. The guardian was not born of wood, but of forgotten light. Was the offering. It was a small black-capped chickadee. It was dead, of course, but the manner of its death was horrific. The bird was not decayed. In fact, it was impossibly preserved. Its small, delicate body was taut and pristine, the feathers glossy and held perfectly in place. It looked as if it had been frozen, or perhaps perfectly petrified by some rapid, mineralizing process. Its talons were curled tight, and its head was slightly tilted, as if listening. But the ultimate horror lay in its eyes. The delicate obsidian spheres of the chickadee's eyes had been meticulously replaced. In their sockets were 2 tiny polished, dark brown cedar knots, smooth and shimmering with solidified, black sap. The arbor line hadn't killed the bird and left it. It had finished it. It had consumed the bird's life story, polished its remains, and then given it its own eyes, eyes of the forest, eyes of the wood. It was an object of art, a horrifying piece of taxidermy created instantaneously by the intelligence of the woods, delivered directly to the writer's page. Elias took an involuntary step back, his nausea overwhelming his hunger. The scent of copper immediately returned, but now it carried an additional biological note, the sharp, musky smell of blood and iron, yet somehow preserved, not rotten. The arbor line had understood his first sentence. It knew he was challenging it, and this gift was its response, a gesture of grotesque, mocking recognition. You are hungry, the gesture implied. I know. I consume what you consume, but my food is perfect, eternal. If you want to fight me with creation, here is a piece of my own, a demonstration of my mastery over form. The bird was placed perfectly on the paper, weighing down the crucial first line of the counter. Narrative. It was a physical and symbolic block, a silent, chilling declaration that the arbor line was not just a mindless force, but a conscious, creative, and dangerously intelligent opponent, it was offering him a piece of itself, a refined, processed, edible piece of the forest, hoping he would see the futility of resistance and accept his role as its next source of sustenance. Elias knew if he touched the bird, the arbor line would flood him with psychic information, perhaps even the memory of the bird, its perfect final absorption. He stood there, trembling, staring at the tiny wooden-eyed corpse on his page. He had reached the end of his isolation. The game was no longer about survival in the wilderness. It was a battle of narratives, a metaphysical conflict between a mortal man and an ancient entity over the right to write the final chapter. Part I was over, the static had broken, and the entity was actively communicating its hostile intent. He reached out his index finger, carefully nudging the bird's body until it rolled off the page and onto the desk. The page was free. The first line remained. The guardian was not born of wood, but of forgotten light, ignoring the screaming hunger and the profound, immediate danger. Elias positioned his hands over the keys. The second sentence was waiting. He had to write faster than the arbor line could consume. He struck the next key, and the typewriter clattered a response into the deep, terrible silence of the woods. We have successfully finished the 10 chapters that make up Part I, completing the setup, the isolation, and the first direct, physical confrontation.